So Nintendo hosted a Treehouse Live just the other day, and this live had roughly 80 minutes of gameplay between Super Mario Bros. Wonder's Nintendo Switch 2 edition, plus Meetup at Bellabel Park, and Pokémon Pokopia. I never know quite what to think about these presentations. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to get an extended look at upcoming games, especially since Nintendo doesn't often release public demos. And while Super Mario Bros. Wonder doesn't necessarily need a demo, since this is just an enhanced edition, a Treehouse Live is still, well, you know, it exists. It's just not my favorite format. That said, I absolutely see the value. If Nintendo isn't going to let players go hands-on early, then an extended showcase is a smart way to let the game breathe and show what actually playing it looks like. In a lot of ways, Treehouse is Nintendo's version of controlled transparency. It was interesting that Nintendo chose to include Super Mario Bros. Wonder here. They focused on new elements, particularly the content included in Meetup at Bellabel Park, but it felt slightly unusual to spotlight a game that technically is already released. Just a little unusual there. I don't know. It was a decision. Maybe that was just my impatience talking, because I'll be completely honest, I was really just there for the Pokemon Pokopia news. Not that Mario Wonder is a bad game, it's not for me. But Pokopia, that's where things get interesting. Before we go any further, this is the input lag. We thoughtfully analyzed Nintendo news, not just what was said, but what it means for actual players. If that's your vibe, subscribe. Now, Pokemon Pokopia. The more I see of this game, the more sold I am. It looks incredibly charming, and I think it's going to resonate really strongly with its audience. We saw nearly an hour of gameplay, and interestingly, I walked away with just as many questions as I did answers. Let's start with the island. I'm beginning to think that the island is not randomly generated at the start, which would be a little disappointing. There's something magical about starting a new Minecraft world and being surprised by the terrain, and I would have loved that same unpredictability here. That said, the random generation may not matter as much as I initially thought. The power of Pokopia seems to be in what we build. If we're going to be reshaping the island anyway, then maybe randomness isn't part of the core appeal. And the island looks massive, by the way. Like way bigger than I was expecting. Not only does the map seem large, but the verticality stood out too. When it comes to customization, it genuinely feels like the sky might be the limit. Throughout the gameplay, we saw the player progress through what is probably the early part of the game, and we know that because we saw the player learning moves from Pokemon on the island, like Cut from Scyther and Rock Smash from Hitmonchan. That footage definitely wasn't new, but we did learn something important. Moves have limited uses before you need to use a Leppa Berry to restore the PP. Personally, I do worry that mechanic could feel restrictive over time, but limitations are often what give life sims their rhythm. And this mechanic reminds me a lot about the tools breaking in Animal Crossing New Horizons, which definitely had its moments where it was a little frustrating, but it also helped the game naturally progress. It created intentional pacing. Here's what we know. Limitations create a resource loop. They force planning, they prevent mindless optimization. Whether that loop feels cozy or tedious will depend entirely on balance. And that balance is something we just aren't gonna know about until we actually play the game. Speaking of resource loops, crafting looks way deeper than I expected. Ditto can use learned moves to gather materials, and those materials can be used to craft items like tables and structures. And something that really stood out to me from the gameplay was the storage interaction. Because if you craft a storage box and place it next to your crafting table, when you go to craft some items, it will naturally pull from your storage box. Does that make sense? That small detail tells me that this is something the developers thought of for long-term play. It's a really smart convenience feature that will prevent late-game friction. Because the more items you store in your storage box, the easier it's going to be to craft materials. I know, genius. But we saw some really interesting mechanics when it comes to building. For example, some of the building that we saw required real time to pass before the structure was actually complete. We saw the construction phases as the Pokemon were working on it. It was really cool. I really love this feature, because not only do you need the materials and the Pokemon to help, but having it take real time adds a lot of weight to the build, and it gives you something to return to later. That kind of gameplay is essential for the longevity of cozy life sims. Now let's talk about habitats. By placing certain items near each other, you create habitats that attract Pokemon to live on your island. There are rarity tiers within these habitats, including common spawns and presumably rarer ones, but this is where some big design questions emerge. Because so far we have not seen any duplicate Pokemon, at least to my knowledge. So does that mean that only one Pokemon species can spawn on your island? For example, if I can only have one Charmander living on my island, then that shifts the identity of the game. Pokemon has always been about abundance, variation, and collection. If species are limited to one per island, that changes the ecosystem from a living world into something more like a curated display. And that has long-term implications. For example, that could mean that there are no shiny Pokemon in Pokemon Pokopia. And if that's the case, that's a real missed opportunity. Shinies aren't just cosmetic, they represent rarity, replayability, and long-term hunting goals. They also would really help with the personalization of your island. And speaking of personalization, can we nickname Pokemon? I know that nicknames may seem small, but personalization drives attachment. And if Pokopia is leaning into long-term emotional investment, then having some personalization really matters. After nearly an hour of gameplay, I'm more intrigued than ever, but I'm also left with some very specific questions, and those answers could determine whether this becomes a cute side experience or something I invest hundreds of hours into. Let's be honest, I'm going to sink an unreasonable amount of time into this game no matter what. The charm absolutely works on me, but charm is the hook. Depth determines longevity. And that's the thing, if there's only one Pidgey on my island, then it really doesn't feel like a Pokemon game. If there are duplicate Pokemon, if shinies exist, if habitats evolve over time, suddenly Pokopia becomes something much bigger. Suddenly this stops being a novelty life sim and starts feeling like a true Pokemon ecosystem. And that's the part I'm still wrestling with. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I think Pokopia has so much potential and I have so much faith in this game. But I personally believe that there are some things that need to happen to change this from a good game to a great game. The ability to have multiple Pokemon of the same species living on my island, having shiny Pokemon being able to give nicknames, all of those things would help move this to a great game in my opinion. As for the Treehouse itself, I do think it accomplished what it needed to accomplish. It gave us extended gameplay, it clarified systems, and it gave players a better sense of what both games actually feel like in motion. Even if Super Mario Bros. Wonder Switch 2 Edition isn't for me personally, I can see why that audience would be excited. But Pokemon Pokopia? That's the one I'll be watching closely. And it releases in just over a week at this point. And speaking of Pokemon releases, Fire Red and Leaf Green are releasing on the Nintendo Switch tomorrow, and they raise some really big questions about how Nintendo is handling legacy Pokemon content in 2026. If you want to dig into what those releases could mean for Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, then this video is definitely for you. This is the Input Lag, where we thoughtfully analyze Nintendo news and talk about what it actually means for players. If that's your vibe, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.